that it was on my side of the wall and bricked it up and left it there. And 8 hours later, we found that children were surfing, and they were teaching each other how to surf. Now remember, this is 1999. They didn't know what a computer was. They'd never seen one before. They didn't know what the internet was. They had no English. So at that time, it was considered utterly impossible what was happening. So people said, you know, there has to be a simple solution. It's just that one of your students must have been passing by and showed them how to use the mouse. And I thought, well, that was pretty feasible. So I wanted to retest my hypothesis that, or my question that of what would happen to children who had never seen a computer before if you confronted them with one. So I repeated the experiment about 300 kilometers away from Delhi in a really remote village where the chances of a passing software professional would be 0. I built another computer, which by that time the press had called this the hole in the wall. So I built another hole in the wall computer over there. There was no place to stay, so I turned it on and I left for a couple of months. And I came back. When I came back, I found a couple of kids playing games on the computer. And as soon as they saw me, they said, "Oh, you're back. We need a faster processor and a better mouse." So it was very astonishing at that time. So I asked them, where on earth did you know all this from? And they said something which I think really changed my whole life. They said, you've given us a machine which works only in English, so we taught ourselves English in order to use it. And they said it very accusingly to me. It's the first time as a teacher I heard the words, taught ourselves. And I thought, well, that's odd. I mean, we spend so much money teaching English to people. Here are kids who say we taught ourselves enough English to handle this computer by ourselves because, you know, we had no choice. So then I got some funding from the World Bank, who were also interested, who said, look, I mean, this seems to have implications on training. And I repeated the experiment properly, you know, designed for all kinds of controls of socioeconomic areas, geographically difficult areas, and it all took about 4 or 5 years. Here's a glimpse of those years. This is the first day at the Hole in the Wall. This little boy on the right, he's 8, and to his left is a student, a bit short, she is 6. And he was teaching her how to browse. In the deserts of Rajasthan, so after 5 years and several measurements, we came to this conclusion that groups of children can learn to operate computers and the internet by themselves. It's not such a great statement today because everybody knows that it's true. But remember, this was 14 years ago. And what this sentence doesn't say is that they will teach themselves to use computers and the internet irrespective of who they are, where they are, how much money they have, and what language they speak. It will happen everywhere. By then, I had done these experiments in Cambodia. I had done them in several countries in Africa. And the results were always identical. At that stage, there was another question that was getting asked around 2005 or 6, which was, so what? So what if children can fiddle around with a computer and, you know, play games? What's it going to do to them, if anything? And I didn't have much of an answer to that question, but I was in luck. because of 3 places where accidentally, years and years later, I came to know what had happened with the hole-in-the-wall computers. Perhaps the most interesting of them is this village called Shirgaon in western India. I had put in a computer there years ago, and many, many years later, a filmmaker was driving up the western coast of India, and she ran into this village called Shirgaon, where out of a dirty little stretch of wall, she saw 2 computers sticking out. And they were still working. And there were children around them. And she stopped and she went up to the children, and the children said, "Hey, hold on, these are computers for children." So she said, "No, I'm not doing anything with them. But who put them there? Where did they come from?" And the children said, "Many years ago, there was a man from New Delhi who came here and who stuck these computers in the wall, and he never came back." So she stopped, and she decided to find out what had happened. And she made a little film on it, which I won't show because it's too long for this talk. But what she did was she tracked a remarkable school teacher, and even more interestingly, a little boy who was then a little boy called Arun. And she has it on film with Arun saying, so she says, "What do you do with this computer?" So Arun says, "I've got really tired of playing games. So, I found a magazine which I like very much." And she says, "So what magazine is that?" And he says, it's called The New Scientist. The New Scientist is read by PhD students who work in biology. So he says, "I found this magazine called New Scientist, and I'm really intrigued by it. I don't understand what it's saying, but I know this much, that one day I'm going to do biotechnology." So the film kind of stops at that point. Back in 2005 or so. Well, in 2012, I met Arun. And I met him in a place which you will find hard to believe. I met him on the campus of Yale in Connecticut, United States. And Arun said he's on a scholarship there, and he's doing a PhD in evolutionary biology. He dropped out of the hole in the wall from another world into ours. So remember when I said turn on, tune in, drop out? It's not drop out of school, it's drop into school from somewhere else. In Hyderabad, India, a little child from a slum school where I had, I'll come to it in a bit, where I had put in this scheme by which teachers, retired school teachers, would come in over Skype and talk to them. Because a slum school in Hyderabad is not where a good teacher would go easily. So I thought I could try and solve that problem with Skype instead. Well, the local school principal said it wasn't such a good idea, and he stopped it. One child had already had a one-to-one kind of mentoring relationship with a lady from England, a retired school teacher from England. Over the next 5 years, he used to take money from his mother, go to a cyber cafe, and Skype her. And she took him from that slum school, year after year, teaching him what to do, guiding him on what forms to fill, and so on and so forth, where he is in medical school in Kuala Lumpur right now. Okay? He too dived or dropped out through the hole in the wall from his world into ours. These are the first of the children. There will be more. So at that point, I was intrigued by this idea that, okay, if they can teach themselves how to use a computer, what else could they teach themselves? So I started experimenting with different subjects like physics and pronunciation, English and algebra, and so on and so forth. The interesting one is on pronunciation. This was in the city of Hyderabad, again in India, where the children were learning English, but they had a problem. They were being taught English by the native language speakers of that area who speak a language called Telugu, which has an extremely strong accent. So the children learn English, but when they come out of school, you can't understand what they're saying, which doesn't help much. So the idea was that if I could change their pronunciation, then they would get jobs, which they otherwise would not get. How do you do that without a trained teacher? But what I did in those days was I bought myself a text-to-speech, sorry, the other way about, a speech-to-text program. And I installed it on one computer, gave it to a school, and told the children to talk into it. So when they spoke into it, the computer produced complete nonsense. The kids laughed and said, it doesn't understand anything of what we are saying. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll leave this computer here for you, and I'll come back in a couple of months' time. You have to make yourselves understood. That's all I said. And when I came back after a couple of months, again, it's all documented and published, I met this little boy outside the classroom. His name was Faizan, I think. And he was all of like 10 or 11 years old. And I say to him, so Faizan, how are you? And Faizan says to me 3 months later, he says, fantastic. So then I sort of went in and found that they'd been working in groups, correcting each other's pronunciation, trying out the same word over and over again until they got it right, and until the correct word came up on the screen. In other words, the learner had invented the pedagogy. That was another lesson for me as a teacher, that they can do that in a circumstance where the teacher is unable to pronounce a pedagogy. I mean, I didn't know how they would do it, but they did it. So we had these results coming in that children who know how to use a computer and the internet can actually learn a whole lot of things by themselves. So I put the learnings of those years into one sentence, saying groups of children can achieve educational objectives on their own. Now, up until now, school teachers were very good friends of mine. After this one, they started becoming a little grim. Around this time, I moved to Newcastle from New Delhi, and I moved because there was a large research grant that had come into Newcastle University to improve the quality of schooling in poor areas of India. So Newcastle called me and said, why don't you come and do this? So I went over. In Newcastle, I gave a similar lecture to a faculty, and their question was that you're kind of overdoing it now. It's one thing to say that children can fiddle around with a computer and teach themselves a few things. It's another thing to say that they can complete.
I'm the gingerbread man. Well done. Very good, so we get.
So back in England, I had a hard job. All these years, all these experiments seemed to point towards another way. A way which will not meet the standards of the age of empire's Victorian schooling, but will meet some standards which have not yet been laid. I decided to bring the hole in the wall into the classroom. Now, how do you do that? It's the simplest thing on earth. You get into one of your classrooms. Let's say you have 24 children or 25 children. And let's say that you're in a nice affluent school. You have 25 computers. We shut 20 computers down. So now you're left with 5. What happens if there are 5 computers and 25 children? Well, the children have to break up into groups. You don't even have to tell them. They will cluster around computers. In an instant, you go back into the hole in the wall. What do you do after that? Well, give them broadband. The kids will want to know, why are you shutting off those 20 computers? And you tell them, because it's all about talking to each other. If you don't talk to each other, and I should have mentioned this earlier, a single child with a single computer will not get to even 20% of what groups of 4 or 5 children talking to each other will in the same period of time. So it's the grouping which causes the acceleration in the learning process. We called this a self-organized learning environment. And here's a glimpse of it. Now, this particular soul was carried out in Gateshead, England, in a school. The question actually came in from Melbourne, Australia. A school teacher in Melbourne, Australia came over on Skype and asked the kids a question. You know, these self-organized learning environment sessions where you have few computers and lots of children is actually driven by a question. And that question has to be very carefully engineered. It can't be a silly question. It has to be something which is really exciting. Okay, I'll give you some examples in a moment. But in this case, the excitement was caused by the fact that here was a teacher coming from, all around the world, from Melbourne, Australia, and he was asking a question. And the question he asked was, how does the climatic conditions in Australia affect the way Australians live? The group that was trying to answer it were 9 years old, from Gateshead, England. It was a remarkable confrontation of your wonderful Australian accent and the Geordie that's spoken in northeastern England. Okay? So the initial part of the interaction was mostly, what? So, but here's how it went.
This afternoon, you're all going to try and answer a really, really hard question. But the hard question has come from very, very far away. It says, climatic environment we have in Australia affect the way we live.
I'm going to have Sarah and George. You're going to be the police men and women. Get yourselves into your teams. Questions on the board. Off you go.
His job is to maintain law and order.
Does Australia sound very different to England then?
Yes.
Do you think your life would be very different if you lived there?
So, but you get the spirit of it. 5 minutes from an Australian teacher in Melbourne, about 5 minutes from this teacher, she's brilliant, her name is Emma Crawley, to set the ball in motion and finally to ask that one question, do you think it will be very different in Australia? So 5 and 5, 10 minutes. 45 minutes of the internet. So that's kind of the essence of the whole thing. The biggest job of the teacher, well, build up to the question, is one big job, step back. Okay? And many teachers have told me that, Sugata, everything else we understand. That bit we find really hard, stepping back. It's very delicate, this method. If you stand up in the middle of it, just stand up, it stops. If you go behind a group of children, and I've seen this happen in England, you go behind a group of children and you say, so what are you doing? And the 9-year-olds who were completely engaged until then turned around to the teacher and said, nothing. Okay, so be careful of that. Unfortunately, down here in Victoria, there was one teacher, this is the archetypal example of mine, who went behind a group of 4 little boys and said to them, see what happens if you don't behave properly. You can't even do a Google search. Okay, and that ended the soul. So you cannot afford to do that. You just have to step back and let it happen. It always results in something that is really beautiful. What do you use as your engine at the end of it is admiration. You say, I'm really glad that you managed to find this, and this one might give us yet another question. And what you'll find the kids doing is that they'll continue with this at home, among themselves, and so on. So when I started this in Gateshead, which is up in northeastern England, the teachers started talking to each other, and they started trying it out in their own schools. And they would write in to me and said, we've tried this and we've tried that, and I would sometimes give them a little bit of advice if I could. Otherwise, I would just read what they're saying. Word got around from this body called Ofsted in England, which actually examines schools, sort of they determine the funding that's to come for next year. And they wrote in their report, it's up there on the internet somewhere, saying, we don't know what's happened in a couple of these schools in Gateshead, but the kids are completely different. So then I realized that the souls are beginning to impact things. And then from the rest of England, I started getting calls, then from Italy, different parts of Europe, then from South America, then from Hong Kong, then from Australia. I went down to the head teachers conference, school principals conference in Melbourne in 2010. It's called the Big Day Out. And there were 3,500 of them. You'd be interested in knowing that in Melbourne, there are several schools now which have almost like integrated this whole aspect into their schooling, and I'm going to be meeting a few of them quite shortly. So I've lost track of how many teachers all over the world are using it, but what is not happening, and which is why I found this conference to be, according to me, a great opportunity, is that so far it's been happening ground upwards. It's individual teachers taking an initiative, trying it out and talking to their colleagues, which is a good way for things to spread, but I've never tried it at the policymaker level. Can it come downwards from the top? Because then it will move that much faster. I don't know how exactly that's to happen, but that's for you to sort of think that how do you do this? It's not as though I'm saying you have to throw curriculum out of the window and you have to throw assessment out of the window. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying before you start a topic, let's say you start a topic on climate change, why not allow the children to explore it for about 45 minutes by themselves, allow the internet into the classroom, and then see how much of your semester is already done. And teachers tell me sometimes it goes up to as high as 70%. So anyhow, here's my position today. I've been a teacher all my life, so it's not easy for me to write this. But I think so. I think this is right. Groups of children can learn anything by themselves, provided you give them three things. Provided they can read, provided they know how to search, and provided once they've searched, once they've read, they have the ability to put everything together. These are the three things that we've got to get into their skill sets. If we can do it by age 7, I would reckon a lot of our jobs is already done. After that, the system will just take off on its own. So I speculate that if you allow education to become a self-organizing system, and this comes from my old subject, physics, that you have chaotic systems, systems like a tidal wave or a thunderstorm. Now, if you say, who made the storm? Nobody made the storm just happened. Who made the tidal wave? The tidal wave just happened. In self-organizing systems, you have properties called emergent phenomenon. How does the butterfly come out of the cocoon of the caterpillar? Nobody makes it happen. It just happens. So could it be that learning becomes an emergent phenomenon if you allow the educational system to self-organize? I don't know. That's what I'm trying to find out. But it's a speculation. We have a couple of lessons from neuroscience, and I'm out of time, so I won't spend too much time on this, but do read up on this if you possibly can, because recent neuroscience has something very interesting to say. It says that at the center of our brains, there's I think it's called the amygdala, popularly known as the lizard brain or the dinosaur brain. It's the remnants of the brain from 100 million years ago, and it does only two things. It can perceive a threat, or it can perceive pleasure. So if you think of it as a needle, it moves from threat to pleasure. When it goes into threat mode, it stops the prefrontal cortex from functioning. It stops all rational thought. What it does is it strengthens your muscles, it hardens your nails, it pulls up your upper lip so that you get a snarl, and you're back 100 million years. That's what threat does. The examination is a threat. We put our children into that situation of threat, shut down their rational abilities, and then we ask them to perform. No wonder we have problems. On the other side of the coin, what neuroscience says, which is also very important, is that if you swing the needle towards pleasure, to the deep end, meaning acceleration, then too, the prefrontal cortex stops. Then too, all reasoning stops. So you cannot go overboard on the other side. Let's have a party is not the idea of how a school should function. That will also stop learning from happening. The job of the institution and the job of the teacher is to keep that needle in the middle. A situation where you're neither threatened nor extraordinarily pleasured, you're just happy, satisfied, and at that point, the 9-year-old brain will work at its optimum. And you can just put in what you like at that point. So these are two things. The other, the last of the interesting findings is that when you're solving a problem, and you can see this in magnetic resonance imaging, when you're solving a problem, your frontal lobe's working very hard, the rational part, trying to work out what could be the solution, what are the different possibilities, and so on. You don't actually solve it. It doesn't solve the problem. It only breaks it down. Which is why often enough you find that you've spent a stressful day trying to sort out some problem that you've got in office or whatever it is and not really making much headway. You come back home and you switch on the television and you put on some stupid soap opera. And as you're watching that, you suddenly say, oh, I know how it's going to work. And MRI shows you how that works. The prefrontal stops, the rest of the brain lights up, and somewhere it assembles the answer. Not from the rational bit, but from the rest, from your history, from your experience, from whatever. So anyhow, so in school, I've tried this very recently in a school in India. I divided a class up into two. To one half of the class, I said, for the next half an hour, you're going to examine this particular question. And at the end of that, I'll come back and I will examine you on what you have found. To the other half, I read out Jabberwocky to them. So they said, what does it mean? So I said, it means nothing. It's not even in English. So they laughed and they said, you can have things that mean nothing. I said, yeah, they have things. So we talked about nonsense for a while. Then I gave them 15 minutes with the same question. And, well, the answers were quite predictable. The threatened part, well, they got the answers, but they got the official answer from the first Google page that they encountered. The other guys, they really examined it. So it's worth experimenting with this at the teaching level and then maybe one day integrating it into design. So in the middle of all this, quite by a fortuitous set of accidents, I got an award, as you just heard. And all my friends, of course, immediately wrote to me with a complete misconception. They all thought that I had $1 million in my bank account. I don't. I don't have even one from TED. The TED Award is given to you in answer to a question. The question is, what would you do if you had $1 million? So I made a plan, and then I have to follow that plan. That plan is a school in the cloud. What is a school in the cloud? Well, I have only a very vague notion of it. It's a school in a place where you cannot have a school, you cannot have good trained teachers, but you can have broadband. And I want to see under those circumstances, can you actually level the playing field? Can you get more of those PhDs into Yale out of there using nothing other than that broadband signal? So for me, it's a facility that eventually should evolve into a global network of mediators. So when I say no teachers, it means no physical teachers. But there is this global network of teachers who actually control these schools. The school has a building, furniture, everything, but everything is controlled by the cloud. So you could sort of grab hold of this school from Sydney and turn the lights on and off or open the windows in Timbuktu. So can we build a school like that? And then can we control pedagogy, curriculum, and everything using just the cloud? Finally getting up to certification and qualification. I think if we do that, we would have finally broken free of the empire model. And we would have got the model that the 21st century deserves. So for me, it's back on the road again. This is the Sundarbans in India, the Ganges Delta. It's Paleolithic community. I was lucky, I found a Paleolithic community. They have nothing. They have no healthcare, no education, nothing at all, except for one thing. They have a strong 3G signal from somewhere. So what happens when the Stone Age meets broadband? Somewhere in those faraway fields, in a couple of years' time, maybe we'll get a glimpse of the future of learning. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Sugata, thank you very much for that inspiring presentation. Don't know anyone else who would be game to stand up here and say that you had a group of grandmothers in the cloud. But no, it is inspiring. There are wonderful things happening. I'm sure those people who will be attending the session straight after morning tea, the two-part session, will certainly be inspired and certainly get some great ideas about souls. So once again, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And
Thank you.
well done.
Thank you. Thanks. Cheers. Thanks.